So, welcome to part 2, guys. I hope you watched part 1 before watching this, but here's a brief rundown. We talked about how the first government structure of the USA was the Articles of Confederation, AOC for short. So, it was state-by-state constitutions by the people, and we discussed if every state had a constitution, every state had its own rules, its own laws, its own everything, that the United States of America would not be truly united. We talked about how each state constitution included a Bill of Rights and some form of separation of powers. Today, we are going to take a look at social revolution when it comes to the Articles of Confederation. I'm no longer looking at my phone for this. I am using my second computer. So, here we go. Social revolution. The political revolution in the late 18th century that resulted in the Articles of Confederation also caused social revolutions. Riots and social conflicts marked the revolutionary era in America. The revolution brought the concept of equality into mainstream American thought. Many colonists seized the opportunity to introduce social reforms to their state constitutions because we are making a new country. That's what we are doing. Whether we like it or not, we actually won the Revolutionary War, and our task is making a new country. That's our goal. And social reforms are a part of that, or want to be a part of that, as well as laws, as well as business, trade and stuff. So there's a lot that goes into a new country, but we are talking about what social aspects are going into making this new country. The spirit of equality was represented in many ways. Property qualifications for voting were lower. It's an important one. Admitting the overwhelmingly majority of white males. However, governmental office holders often had to meet a higher landholding requirement. In Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina, seats in the state legislation were reapportioned, so the backcountry western districts were given fair representation. So, landowner requirements were, to the general public, lowered substantially, allowing for more people, sadly, because of slavery and all that, it was mostly white people, to vote and to interact. Social democracy was stimulated by the formation of trade organizations for commoners like artisans and laborers. Inheritance laws were abolished, including, okay, a law that awarded all of a father's property to the eldest son. So if my father died and I'm the oldest son, I would get the property automatically. So those rules were tossed out. This gave the property owner the right to prevent his heirs from ever disposing of the land. As approximately 80,000 Tories or British loyalists departed from America, they left behind many large estates that were confiscated by the state legislatures. The land was broken up and sold as small farms or passed out as compensation for war veterans. Because under the Articles of Confederation, there was no taxes. That was another weakness. So all these war veterans that fought in the American Revolution did not get a paycheck. So this was a alternative in some cases. During this time of social revolution, steps were taken towards greater religious freedoms and the separation of church and state. The Anglican Church was disestablished because of its associations to the British Crown, and it reformed as the Protestant Episcopal Church. As religious freedom expanded, new faiths emerged, and some of the first national church bodies were formed. The Methodists came together in a general conference in 1784. The newly formed Episcopal Church gathered in 1789 to unite the various dioceses. The Presbyterians also held their first National Assembly in 1789. In 1790, the Catholic Church placed its first bishop in America. All but Virginia had removed tax support for the church before the end of the Revolution. Finally, in 1786, the Virginia State Statute of Religious Freedom, written by Thomas Jefferson, enforced the separation of church and state. So, this is a big thing. And I would like to know what this means to you. Separation of church and state. Because this was unheard of in both Britain and the colonies. So this separation of church and state. And we're just folding and folding and folding this paper. So, church being religion, and state being government. So, what does that mean? Because we still have In God We Trust on paper money, right? Yeah, that's right. I have it right here. It says, In God We Trust. So, thinking critically moment here is what I like to do. Is there a type of this? Like, let's say 90%. Is there 90% of this? Or is it full separation of church and state? And if you say it's full separation of church and state, which I'm not saying is a good thing or a bad thing, if it's full, why do we have In God We Trust right there? And it's not focusing on our paper money. That's something you have to consider. In 1774, the Continental Congress called for complete abolition of the slave trade, and many of the states responded positively. Beginning with Pennsylvania in 1780, the northern states all abolished slavery outright or provided for the gradual emancipation of blacks. In most of these states, slaves born after a certain date were freed once they reached a stated age, generally 18 or 21 years old. So, we already see North versus South. And we will continue to see this pop up throughout discussions until we get to the Civil War. It's a North versus South issue. That's what slavery is. We see this here, we see this in the soon 3/5 compromise. We see this all around town. In contrast, no states south of Pennsylvania abolished slavery. Many of the southern states did go as far as relaxing laws which removed restrictions on the right of individual owners to free the slaves. During that period, many slaves ran away, especially those in the upper South, because they feel like, I'll escape, go to the North, and I'm free. Bing, bum, bada bing. The runaways would take refuge in the growing number of African American communities in the South. In the North, so growing African Americans in the North. This is the first of many migrations or slave runaway attempts that we'll see in this first part of our country's history. As Americans continued to consider the rights of the individual, subtle changes to the legal rights of women transpired. In the 18th century, women had remained confined to the domestic sphere. They could not vote, preach, hold office, or obtain a divorce. In many colonies, they had no legal rights over their children and could not legally own personal property. Wartime experiences gave women a new sense of independence and responsibility. During the Revolution, women were forced to take on many roles that were previously considered masculine. Women plowed fields, managed shops and businesses, and supported the armies by handling supplies, served as couriers, and performed more traditional roles like cooking and nursing. Women even occasionally took their husbands' places in the line when they could no longer fight. So, a lot of these compromises, a lot of these reforms brought new questions because our goal is making a new country. And part of that is social reforms. And how are we going to treat education, women, slaves, all of that? And the slavery issue is complicated. For another video we'll get into very soon. And so I'm gonna wrap it up by asking you guys a question. How can a country build itself up? How can a country build itself up? So we had three ideas. Making a new country fell into social reforms, laws, and business, like trade. So how can a country build itself up? So think about that as we continue to plow through the Constitution and the first part of true American history.